are slowly floating into a deep, peaceful sleep.
Ritual 1. Putting animals on trial. Animals accused of causing harm were formally tried in medieval courts, following legal procedures similar to human trials. In medieval Europe, when an animal caused serious trouble, people sometimes responded in a way that feels unusual today, but felt orderly and reasonable to them. Instead of reacting emotionally, communities often treated the animal as if it were part of the legal system. A pig, a cow, or even a group of rats could be brought before a court. This was not done in haste. It followed a routine that people were already familiar with. Officials were present. Accusations were read aloud. The process moved slowly and formally. From the medieval perspective, this ritual helped restore balance. Life was structured around rules, customs, and visible order. When something disrupted that order, even an animal, the response was to place it back inside a system people trusted. The court setting made the event feel controlled and understandable. Nothing about it was rushed. Everyone involved already knew their role and simply followed it. For the people watching, this ritual was not entertainment. It was part of maintaining daily stability. The slow pace, the repeated legal phrases, and the familiar setting made the situation feel settled rather than chaotic. Once the trial ended, the community felt that the matter had been properly handled. Then life quietly returned to its usual rhythm, much like everything else in the medieval world. Ritual 2. Sitting quietly before lying down. People paused in stillness before allowing the body to fully rest. Before lying down to sleep, many medieval people did not move directly from activity into bed. Instead, they sat quietly for a short time, often on the edge of a bench, a stool, or the bed itself. This pause was not formal or ceremonial. It was simply a moment where movement stopped and the body adjusted. During this time, nothing was required. There was no thinking about the day, and no planning for the next one. The body settled on its own as breathing slowed naturally. The warmth of the room and the quiet of the night helped this transition happen without effort. Sitting allowed the body to release tension gradually. Muscles that had been active during the day softened. The spine rested upright without strain. Hands lay loosely, doing nothing. This position required little energy, but still kept the body awake enough to unwind slowly. The mind followed the body. Without movement, thoughts lost urgency. There was no distraction pulling attention outward. The quiet before lying down created a gentle boundary between activity and rest. This pause also reduced restlessness later. By allowing the body to settle first, there was less need to shift or adjust after lying down. The transition into stillness became smoother. No time was measured. Sometimes the pause was brief. Sometimes it lasted longer. It ended naturally, not by decision but by readiness. When the body felt heavy and calm, lying down happened easily. By sitting quietly before lying down, medieval people gave rest room to begin before sleep itself. This small pause softened the body and mind together, making the night feel slower, steadier, and easier to enter without force. Ritual 3. Writing formal letters to pests. Communities sometimes sent official letters to rats or insects, politely asking them to leave the area. In some medieval towns, when rats, insects, or other pests became a problem, people did not immediately turn to force. Instead, they followed a ritual that felt appropriate to their understanding of order and fairness. Officials or church representatives would compose a formal letter, written carefully and read aloud in public. The letter politely asked the animals to leave fields, homes, or storage areas. The language used was calm and respectful, similar to how one would address a human group. This ritual reflected the belief that everything in the world had a place within a larger moral structure. By addressing pests formally, people felt they were acknowledging that structure rather than acting impulsively. The act of writing, reading, and delivering the letter mattered more than whether the animals responded. It allowed the community to feel that the situation had been handled correctly. The process itself was slow and deliberate. Words were chosen carefully. The reading followed a familiar rhythm. People stood quietly and listened, already knowing how it would proceed. Afterward, there was a sense of completion. Whether the pests left or not, the ritual had restored a feeling of control. Life then continued as normal, with planting, cooking, and sleeping returning to their usual, predictable patterns. Ritual 4. Removing eyebrows for beauty. Some medieval women removed their eyebrows and eyelashes to match popular beauty standards. In certain periods of the medieval era, beauty was defined very differently than it is today. A high, smooth forehead was considered desirable, and achieving it required patience and repetition. Women would slowly remove their eyebrows, and sometimes even their eyelashes, using simple tools. This was not done quickly or dramatically. It was a careful, habitual process, often repeated over time to maintain the preferred appearance. There was nothing rebellious about this ritual. It was simply following the expectations of the time. Beauty standards were learned early and reinforced quietly through observation. Women did not question them openly. They repeated the same grooming actions because that was what was considered proper. The routine itself became familiar and unremarkable. This ritual often took place in calm, private moments. Movements were slow. Attention was steady. There was no urgency involved. Once finished, the result blended into daily life without comment. It was not meant to stand out, only to align with what was considered normal. Like many medieval customs, this practice was less about expression and more about consistency. Afterward, the day continued with chores, meals, and rest, unchanged by the quiet ritual that had just taken place. Ritual 5. Celebrating the Feast of Fools. Once a year, lower clergy temporarily reversed church roles in a ritualized celebration. In parts of medieval Europe, there existed a ritual that unfolded slowly and predictably each year, known as the Feast of Fools. It was not an unexpected event, nor was it treated as disorderly. The date was known in advance, and people anticipated it in the same quiet way they anticipated other religious observances. On this day, members of the lower clergy were permitted to step into roles usually held by higher-ranking church officials. This reversal was symbolic and temporary, never intended to threaten authority. The ritual followed familiar structures so that it remained contained. Ceremonies were carried out using movements, words, and clothing that closely mirrored standard church practices. The difference was subtle rather than extreme. Gestures were repeated slowly, and the order of events remained recognizable. Even the humor involved was restrained, following expectations rather than improvisation, because everything unfolded within known boundaries. The ritual felt controlled and calm. For the community, this brief reversal served as a way to acknowledge hierarchy rather than disrupt it. Everyone understood that the roles would return to normal when the day ended, and they did, without announcement or debate. The following morning, prayers resumed as usual. Work continued. Meals were eaten in silence or soft conversation. The Feast of Fools passed quietly into memory, leaving daily life unchanged, steady, and familiar. Ritual 6. Bloodletting as a health routine. People regularly removed blood as part of maintaining balance in the body. Bloodletting was a medical ritual deeply woven into medieval daily life, practiced with calm acceptance rather than fear. The prevailing belief was that the body contained different elements that needed to remain in balance. Removing blood was thought to help restore that balance. This idea was widely accepted and rarely questioned, which made the practice feel routine rather than alarming. The process followed a predictable sequence. A barber surgeon prepared tools slowly, often in the same workspace used countless times before. The person receiving treatment sat quietly, sometimes watching, sometimes looking away. Conversation was minimal. There was no urgency, because the ritual itself was familiar to everyone involved. Each movement followed tradition rather than experimentation. Afterward, the wound was wrapped carefully, and the person rested briefly before returning home. There was no expectation of immediate improvement. Bloodletting was not dramatic medicine. It was preventative and habitual. People trusted it because it had always been done. Once completed, the day continued as usual. Chores resumed. Meals were eaten. Evening prayers were said. The ritual blended into daily life, becoming just another repeated action that marked time rather than change. Ritual 7. Using urine for cleaning and craft. Households collected urine for use in tanning, washing, and dyeing. In medieval households, urine was regarded as a practical resource rather than waste. Collecting it followed a quiet, well understood routine. Containers were placed in specific locations, and everyone in the household knew their purpose. No explanations were required because the practice was inherited through repetition. Urine was commonly used in tasks such as washing cloth, treating leather, and preparing dyes. These processes were slow and methodical. When enough liquid had been collected, it was used carefully, following steps learned through experience rather than written instruction. The work required patience, not speed. People moved steadily, repeating the same motions each time. This ritual did not interrupt daily life. It occurred alongside cooking, cleaning, and other chores. There was no embarrassment attached to it, because it was ordinary. Once the urine had been used, containers were rinsed and returned to their place. The household moved on without pause. Over time, the repetition made the practice almost invisible. It was not discussed or questioned. It was simply part of how things were done, blending quietly into the steady rhythm of medieval domestic life. Ritual 8. Diagnosing illness by examining urine. Physicians studied urine closely to understand a person's health. When illness appeared in medieval life, one common response was a careful examination of urine. This was a recognized medical ritual, performed methodically by physicians. The urine was collected and presented in a vessel, often transparent, so it could be observed properly. The act itself was calm and deliberate. The physician examined the liquid slowly, noting its color, clarity, and thickness. Sometimes it was held up to the light. This observation followed established teachings rather than instinct. There was no rush to judgment. Patients waited quietly, trusting the ritual because it was familiar and structured, even when conclusions were uncertain. The examination provided reassurance. It created a sense of order during illness. Afterward, advice might be given or rest recommended. The urine was disposed of, and the physician departed. The household returned to quiet activity. The ritual had been completed correctly, and that correctness mattered more than certainty. Life resumed its usual pace, calm and predictable. Ritual 9. Wearing protective charms daily. People carried small objects believed to guard against harm. Many medieval people wore protective charms as part of their everyday routine. These objects were small, often simple, and easy to carry. They were made from materials like wood, cloth, or metal. The belief in their protective quality was steady rather than emotional. Wearing a charm was considered sensible, not dramatic. Each morning, the charm was placed in the same position. This action became habitual over time. People did not pause to think about it. They simply included it in their routine, much like dressing or eating. The repetition gave the action a calming quality. Once worn, the charm faded into the background of daily life. It was rarely noticed again until nightfall. Work, travel, and rest continued as usual. The ritual did not interrupt life. It blended into it. By repeating this small act every day, people felt they had quietly prepared themselves for whatever might come. Then the day moved forward, steady and unchanged, just like the days before it. Ritual 10. Ringing bells to control time. Church and town bells were used daily to signal when people should work, rest, or return home. In medieval towns and villages, time was not measured quietly or privately. Instead, it was shared aloud through the steady ringing of bells. This ritual happened every day and followed a pattern that rarely changed. Bells rang in the morning to signal the start of work. They rang again to mark prayer times, meals, and the approach of evening. People did not check clocks. They listened. The sound of the bell moved through the air slowly, reaching fields, streets, and homes. When it was heard, people responded without discussion. Tools were set down. Hands were wiped clean. Movement shifted naturally, as they always had. There was comfort in this repetition. The bell removed the need to decide what time it was. It told everyone at once. This ritual created a shared rhythm. Entire communities moved together through the day, guided by sound rather than urgency. Even when someone was tired or distracted, the bell gently brought attention back to routine. No explanation was needed. Children grew up learning what each bell meant simply by hearing it again and again. At night, the final bell signaled rest. Doors were closed. Fires were tended. The day ended not with conversation, but with sound fading into silence. The bell had done its work. The ritual repeated the next day, unchanged, steady, and dependable. Ritual 11. Public shaming as a moral ritual. Minor offenses were addressed through calm, structured public embarrassment. When someone broke a small rule in medieval society, the response was often ritualized rather than emotional. Public shaming was used not to create fear, but to restore order. The process followed familiar steps, so it never felt chaotic. A person might be placed in a visible location, such as a square or platform, where others could see them. The ritual was quiet and slow. There was no shouting or sudden movement. People passed by, observed briefly, and continued on their way. The presence of the offender served as a reminder rather than a spectacle. Because this method was repeated over generations, it carried a sense of normality for the person involved. The experience was uncomfortable but predictable. There was an understanding that the ritual would end. It had a beginning, a middle, and a clear conclusion. Once complete, the person returned to daily life without ongoing punishment. This ritual reinforced shared expectations gently. It did not rely on force. It relied on visibility and repetition. Afterward, the town returned to its usual pace. Markets reopened. Work resumed. The structure of daily life remained intact, calm, and orderly. Ritual 12. Guild Initiation Ceremonies. Apprentices entered trades through formal, repeated initiation rituals. Joining a medieval guild was not a sudden event. It was marked by a ritual that unfolded slowly and carefully. Apprentices who had completed their training were welcomed through ceremonies that followed established traditions. These rituals were familiar to everyone involved because they rarely changed. The initiation often took place in a known setting. Tools were displayed. Words were spoken in a specific order. Gestures were repeated exactly as they had been for years. There was no improvisation. Each step signaled a transition from one role to another. For the apprentice, the ritual provided clarity. It marked the end of learning and the beginning of responsibility. The slow pace allowed the moment to feel settled rather than overwhelming. Others watched quietly, knowing they had once stood in the same place. Once the ceremony ended, the new guild member returned to work. Nothing dramatic followed. The ritual was complete. It had served its purpose. The workshop resumed its normal sounds. Life continued, steady and familiar, shaped by repetition rather than change. Ritual 13. Walking in religious processions. Communities regularly moved together through streets in slow, repeated religious walks. In medieval towns, religious processions were a familiar and repeated part of life. They were not rare events reserved only for special moments. Instead, they happened often enough that people knew exactly how they would unfold. On the chosen day, individuals gathered quietly, standing in positions they already understood. There was no confusion about where to go or how fast to move. Everyone followed the same pace, slow and measured. As the procession began, people walked through streets they traveled every day, but in a different state of mind. Movement was deliberate. Steps were taken evenly. No one rushed ahead. The purpose was not to arrive somewhere quickly, but to move together. Prayers or chants were spoken softly and repeatedly, creating a rhythm that matched the pace of walking. For many participants, this ritual created a sense of calm order. The repetition of steps, words, and familiar sights made the experience predictable. Children learned the route simply by walking it year after year. Adults rarely spoke during the procession. Silence filled the spaces between words, making the walk feel longer and slower. When the procession ended, people did not linger. They returned to their homes and daily tasks without discussion. The ritual had been completed. Nothing had changed. And that was the point. The streets returned to normal use. Life continued with the same steady rhythm it always followed. Ritual 14. Blessing homes against misfortune. Households regularly performed quiet rituals to protect their homes from unseen harm. In medieval life, the home was not just a place to live. It was something that needed regular attention and care, both physical and spiritual. Many households followed rituals meant to protect the home from illness, bad luck, or unseen danger. These rituals were performed calmly and without urgency. They were repeated so often that they became part of the background of daily life. A blessing might involve speaking familiar words near the doorway, touching certain objects, or placing small symbols in known locations. These actions were not dramatic. They were done slowly and carefully, often at the same time of day. The repetition mattered more than the belief itself. By doing the same thing again and again, people felt reassured. The ritual usually took place in silence or soft speech. There was no audience. Family members might be present, or the action might be done alone. Movements were gentle. Nothing was rushed. Once completed, the home felt settled, even if nothing visibly changed. Afterward, daily routines resumed immediately. Cooking, cleaning, and resting continued without pause. The blessing did not interrupt life, it blended into it. By repeating this ritual regularly, households felt they were quietly maintaining balance. The home remained familiar, calm, and unchanged, and that familiarity brought comfort as night approached. Ritual 15. Annual confession as a routine. People regularly confessed their sins in a calm, repeated ritual, even when nothing serious had occurred. In medieval life, confession was not treated as an emotional outpouring or a dramatic moment. For most people, it was a routine obligation that returned again and again at predictable times of the year. Individuals approached confession knowing in advance how it would proceed. The words had been spoken before. The setting was familiar. There was no surprise involved. People often confess small, ordinary matters, forgetting prayers, speaking impatiently, feeling envy. These admissions were repeated year after year, sometimes with very little variation. The act of confession mattered more than the content. Speaking the words aloud created a sense of order and completion. It marked time and responsibility rather than personal transformation. The ritual itself unfolded slowly. The confessor listened without interruption. The penitent spoke calmly, without urgency. Advice, if given, was brief and familiar. There were no raised voices, no dramatic reactions. Everything about the exchange encouraged steadiness and reflection. After confession, people returned to their lives without lingering on the experience. There was no expectation of change overnight. The ritual had been fulfilled, and that was enough. Work continued. Meals were eaten. Evening arrived as usual. Confession became another quiet marker in the year, repeated reliably, offering structure rather than intensity, and settling gently into the rhythm of everyday life. Ritual 16. Marking days with census calendars. Daily life was quietly guided by a repeating cycle of saints' days that structured time. In medieval life, time moved in a slow and familiar loop shaped by saints' calendars. Days were not primarily remembered by numbers or months, but by names that returned every year in the same order. These names were spoken often and heard from childhood until they felt as natural as sunrise and sunset. People rarely questioned what day it was meant to be. They simply knew. Each saint's day carried gentle expectations. Some suggested restraint, others allowed rest. A few encouraged prayer or quiet reflection. These expectations were not enforced loudly. They were followed because they had always been followed. Work adjusted slightly. Conversations softened. Certain activities were delayed without frustration. Life bent calmly around the calendar. The repetition of these days created a soothing sense of predictability. People could feel where they were in the year without effort. The rhythm settled into memory. A person might remember planting crops after one saint and repairing tools after another, not because they were instructed, but because the pattern had repeated for years. Children learned the calendar by living inside it. They heard the same names spoken at meals and gatherings. Over time, the sequence became familiar and comforting. Adults rarely marked the passage of time with urgency. There was always another saint's day approaching, another familiar marker waiting quietly ahead. When a day ended, it passed without ceremony. The next name arrived. Time continued forward without pressure, guided by repetition rather than change. And the steady return of these days helped life feel calm, ordered, and gently predictable as evening settled in. Ritual 17. Lighting candles at the same hour. Households followed a quiet habit of lighting candles at familiar times each evening. In medieval homes, evening arrived gradually, and the lighting of candles followed a pattern that rarely changed. As daylight softened and shadows stretched across the room, someone reached for a candle without needing to be told. The timing felt natural, learned through repetition rather than instruction. This small act marked the gentle transition from day to night. Candles were lit carefully and without hurry. The flame was watched for a moment, just long enough to be sure it steadied. One candle often followed another, placed in locations that never changed. The light they gave was soft and limited, encouraging calm rather than activity. Brightness was not the goal, familiarity was. This ritual happened day after day, regardless of season. In winter, it came earlier. In summer, it waited longer, but the action itself remained the same. The slow movement, the quiet pause, the brief attention to the flame all created a sense of closure for the day's work. Once the candles were lit, voices lowered naturally. Tasks became simpler. The room felt smaller and more contained. Nothing dramatic followed. People settled into the evening knowing that the ritual had done its work. Night had been acknowledged, gently and without disruption. Ritual 18. Sharing bread before the first bite. Meals often began with a brief, repeated pause before eating together. Ritual 18. Sharing bread before the first bite. Meals often began with a brief, repeated pause before eating together. Before meals, especially the evening meal, medieval households often paused in a familiar way. Bread was present, placed where everyone could see it. No one reached for food immediately. Instead, there was a moment of stillness that everyone recognized. It was not announced. It simply happened. Someone broke the bread slowly. The sound was soft and expected. Pieces were handed out calmly, sometimes in the same order every time. This small action marked the true beginning of the meal. Eating before this moment would have felt unfinished, as if a step had been skipped. The ritual did not involve long words or elaborate gestures. Its power came from repetition. Day after day, the same pause occurred. Children learned to wait without being reminded. Adults felt the rhythm settle into their bodies. The meal unfolded at an unhurried pace, guided by this quiet beginning. After the bread was shared, conversation began naturally, or not at all. There was no pressure to speak. The ritual had already created a sense of togetherness. As the meal continued, the pause faded into memory, but its calming effect remained, allowing the evening to proceed slowly, steadily, and without rush. Ritual 19: Ringing bells at fixed hours. Communities followed the repeated sound of bells to quietly mark the passage of the day. In medieval towns and villages, bells rang at fixed hours so consistently that people rarely needed clocks. The sound arrived exactly when expected, drifting across fields, streets, and homes with a steady calmness. No one was startled by it. The bell did not interrupt life. It blended into it, marking time without demanding action. When the bell rang, people continued what they were doing, but with a slight internal adjustment. A task might slow, a thought might pause. The sound created a gentle boundary between moments. Morning bells suggested beginning. Midday bells suggested continuation. Evening bells suggested release. Everyone understood this without explanation. The tone of the bell rarely changed. The rhythm stayed the same year after year. Children grew up hearing it so often that it became part of their internal sense of time. Even when the bell was distant or faint, it still carried meaning. People felt reassured knowing it had rung, even if they barely noticed it. As night approached, the final bell carried a quieter significance. It reminded people that work should end soon and rest would follow. When the sound faded, silence returned naturally. The bell had done its job. Time had been marked. Life moved forward slowly, guided by sound, repetition, and familiarity. Ritual 20: Washing hands before evening rest. People followed a simple ritual of washing hands as the day quietly came to an end. As daylight faded and work gradually slowed, many medieval households followed the same gentle evening habit. Hands were washed before resting. This was not done quickly or carelessly. The action unfolded at an unhurried pace, signaling that effort was ending and calm was beginning. Water was prepared without rush. Hands were placed beneath it slowly. The sensation was familiar and grounding. Dirt and residue from the day were removed, but so was tension. The act separated labor from rest, not through words, but through repetition. The body learned this signal over time. This ritual happened every evening, regardless of how the day had gone. Hard days ended the same way as easy ones. That consistency mattered. Children observed it and copied it without instruction. Adults performed it automatically, knowing what came next. After washing, movements became quieter, voices softened. The home felt settled. Nothing dramatic followed. The ritual did not demand reflection or discussion. It simply closed the day. By repeating this small action night after night, medieval life created a dependable transition into rest, allowing the mind to slow and the body to prepare gently for sleep. Ritual 21: Sitting quietly before nightfall. People often paused together in silence as daylight slowly faded. As the day moved toward evening, many medieval households followed a quiet habit that required no instruction. Before lamps were lit and before night fully arrived, people sat down and did very little. This pause was not announced, and it was not treated as special. It happened simply because it always had. The sitting itself had no strict rules. Some rested on benches. Others remained near doorways or hearths. Hands were kept still or folded loosely. Eyes rested on familiar surroundings. No one rushed to fill the silence. Words were unnecessary. The pause existed on its own. This ritual created a soft boundary between work and rest. The body, having moved all day, slowly adjusted to stillness. Breathing deepened without effort. Thoughts wandered gently and then settled. The fading light outside mirrored the slowing pace inside the home. Children learned this habit naturally. They watched adults sit quietly and followed without being told. Over time, the silence became comfortable rather than awkward. It signaled safety and completion. The day had been lived. Nothing more was required of it. When the pause ended, it ended naturally. Someone stood. Someone lit a lamp. Evening continued without disruption. The ritual left no clear beginning or end, only a lingering calm. By repeating this quiet sitting each day, medieval life allowed rest to arrive gradually, preparing both mind and body for the slower hours ahead. Ritual 22. Closing doors at the same time each night. Homes followed a repeated routine of securing doors as darkness settled. As night approached, medieval households closed their doors in a familiar sequence that rarely changed. This was not done in haste or fear. It was simply part of the evening's rhythm. The same doors were checked in the same order, night after night. The action was slow and deliberate. Hands touched worn wood. Latches were secured with practiced movements. The sounds were soft and recognizable. No one spoke much during this ritual because nothing needed explaining. Everyone already understood what was happening. Closing the doors marked a clear transition. The outside world was gently set aside. Sounds from the street or fields became distant. Inside, the home felt smaller and more contained. This sense of enclosure brought comfort rather than restriction. Children observed the process and remembered it. As they grew older, they took part without instruction. Adults performed the ritual almost without thinking. The repetition reassured them that the night would pass as it always had. Once the doors were closed, no attention lingered on them. The ritual was complete. People moved toward rest without urgency. By repeating this same action every night, medieval households created a dependable signal that the day had ended, allowing the body to relax and the mind to release the need for vigilance, settling calmly into the quiet hours of night. Ritual 23. Saying the same night prayers. People repeated familiar prayers each night in the same order before rest. As night settled in, many medieval people followed a prayer routine that changed very little over a lifetime. The words were known by heart. They did not need to be read or carefully recalled. The sequence unfolded automatically, shaped by years of repetition rather than conscious effort. This familiarity was part of what made the ritual calming. The prayers were spoken quietly, often in a low, even voice. Sometimes they were whispered, sometimes they were only mouthed. The pace was unhurried. There was no pressure to feel anything specific. The purpose was not emotional intensity, but consistency. Saying the same words each night created a sense of closure. The setting rarely changed. Prayers were spoken near a bed, beside a bench, or close to the hearth. Hands might be folded or rest loosely. Eyes often closed, not in concentration, but in comfort. The body already knew what to do, and that knowledge allowed the mind to slow. Children learned these prayers early by listening. Over time, they joined in softly, matching the rhythm of the adults. As they grew older, the words stayed with them. Even when days were long or tiring, the prayers remained the same. That sameness mattered. When the final words were spoken, there was no announcement that the ritual had ended. It simply faded into silence. People lay down or remained still for a moment longer. The day felt complete. By repeating the same prayers night after night, medieval life created a gentle mental signal that it was safe to rest, allowing thoughts to loosen and sleep to arrive naturally. Ritual 24. Laying out clothes for the next day. People quietly prepared their clothing each night before resting. As the evening moved closer to rest, many medieval people followed a quiet habit that brought a sense of order to the coming day. Before sleep, clothing was laid out carefully. This was not done quickly or without thought. Each piece was placed where it could be found easily in the morning, in the same spot it had been placed many nights before. The action itself was slow and familiar. Tunics were folded gently. Belts were set aside without sound. Shoes were placed near the bed or doorway, always facing the same direction. There was no urgency in this process. The day was already over, and the next one did not need to be rushed toward. This ritual served a calming purpose. By preparing clothing in advance, the mind released the need to think ahead. Morning decisions were removed from the future. Everything had already been handled. That certainty allowed the body to relax more fully. Children learned this habit simply by watching. At first, they needed reminders. Over time, they copied the movements on their own. Adults performed the ritual almost without awareness, guided by memory and repetition rather than planning. The room felt more settled once the clothes were laid out. Nothing remained unfinished. The ritual created a sense of quiet readiness, not anticipation. When it was complete, there was no sense of accomplishment, only calm closure. Afterward, people moved toward rest naturally. They lay down knowing that the next morning would begin smoothly, without confusion or haste. By repeating this small preparation each night, medieval life created a gentle bridge between days, allowing sleep to arrive without lingering thoughts or unfinished concerns. Ritual 25. Extinguishing the hearth fire slowly. Holmes followed a careful routine for letting the hearth fire fade at night. As night settled fully into the household, attention often turned to the hearth fire. This fire had been present throughout the day, supporting cooking, warmth, and quiet gathering. Extinguishing it was not done suddenly. It followed a familiar, unhurried routine that people had repeated countless times before. Rather than putting the fire out completely, embers were arranged gently. Ash was moved carefully over glowing coals. The goal was not to erase the fire, but to let it rest. Movements were slow and deliberate. Hands knew exactly where to place the ash, guided by memory rather than instruction. This ritual required patience. Rushing could waste fuel or cause unnecessary smoke, so people took their time. They watched the glow dim gradually. The sound of crackling softened. Heat eased into a steady, contained warmth. The room felt quieter as the fire settled. Children often observed this process from a distance. Over time, they learned the rhythm without being taught. Adults performed the ritual almost automatically, aware of each step, but not focused on it. The repetition itself brought reassurance. The fire had been handled properly. Nothing more was needed. Once the hearth was settled, the home felt complete for the night. The day's energy had been carefully stored away. The fire, like the people, was allowed to rest. Afterward, there was no lingering attention given to it. People moved toward sleep knowing that warmth could be revived in the morning. By repeating this gentle closing ritual each night, medieval households created a calm ending to the day, allowing both the home and its occupants to enter the quiet hours in a steady and settled state. Ritual 26. Checking the same corners before bed. People followed a quiet habit of looking over familiar spaces each night as the household prepared for rest. Many medieval people followed a simple and repeated routine. Before settling down, they looked over the same corners of their home. This was not done out of worry or fear. It was done because it had always been done. The action felt reassuring rather than urgent. The checking moved slowly and followed a familiar path. A glance toward the doorway. A brief look near stored tools or food. A moment spent near the hearth or sleeping area. Nothing was moved. Nothing was adjusted unless it clearly needed to be. The purpose was observation, not correction. This ritual helped the mind settle by visually confirming that everything was in its expected place. The day felt complete. There were no unanswered questions left behind. The home appeared calm and unchanged, just as it had the night before. Children learned this habit naturally. At first, they followed adults quietly. Later, they performed the same small checks on their own. Over time, the act required very little attention. The body knew where to look, and the eyes followed without effort. The pace was unhurried. There was no rush to finish. Each glance blended smoothly into the next. Silence filled the space between movements. The ritual did not interrupt rest. It prepared for it. When the final corner had been checked, there was no sense of relief or accomplishment. There was only calm certainty. The home was as it should be. People then lay down or sat quietly, allowing the body to relax fully. By repeating this gentle habit each night, medieval life created a dependable closing signal, easing the transition from wakefulness into sleep without strain or thought. Ritual 27. Listening to night sounds without comment. People allowed the familiar sounds of night to pass without reacting to them. As darkness settled fully and activity faded, medieval people often lay still and listened to the sounds around them. This was not an intentional practice taught with words. It developed naturally through repetition. At night, the world sounded different, and people learned to accept those sounds without responding. Wood shifted as it cooled. Animals moved outside. Wind passed through narrow streets or open land. These sounds were not identified or discussed. They were allowed to exist in the background. No effort was made to interpret them. Listening did not require attention. It happened quietly and passively. This habit helped the mind release control. By not reacting, the body learned that the night did not require vigilance. Sounds came and went without consequence. Breathing slowed naturally as the ears adjusted to the steady rhythm of the environment. Children learned this habit early. At first, unfamiliar noises drew curiosity. Over time, those same sounds became part of comfort. Adults rarely acknowledged them at all. The night had its own voice, and it was trusted. Stillness followed naturally. The absence of response created space for rest. Thoughts softened and then loosened. The boundary between waking and sleeping became less defined. Nothing needed to be done. By repeating this quiet acceptance night after night, medieval life trained the body to rest alongside sound rather than against it. The world continued moving softly in the background, and people drifted into sleep knowing that everything necessary would continue without their attention. Ritual 28. Keeping the same sleeping position. People often settled into a familiar posture each night without thinking about it. As night deepened and the household grew quiet, many medieval people lay down in the same way they had the night before. This was not a rule that needed enforcing. It was a habit shaped by repetition. The body remembered where to rest and how to settle, and it followed that memory without effort. Sleeping spaces were simple and rarely changed. Beds, benches, or floor coverings remained in the same positions for long periods of time. Because of this consistency, people naturally adopted a familiar posture. Arms rested where they always had. Legs settled into a position that felt known rather than chosen. The body adjusted slowly, without restlessness. This ritual reduced decision making at the end of the day. There was no searching for comfort. Comfort had already been learned. By returning to the same posture night after night, the body recognized it as a signal that activity was finished. Muscles loosened gradually. Breathing slowed without instruction. Children developed these habits early. At first, they shifted often. Over time, their bodies settled into patterns just like the adults around them. The familiarity created reassurance. Nothing new was required of the night. Even when sleep did not come immediately, remaining in the same position provided steadiness. The body stayed calm, knowing that movement was unnecessary. Stillness allowed thoughts to fade on their own. By repeating this quiet habit each night, medieval life allowed rest to arrive gently. The body learned to associate a single, familiar posture with safety and completion, easing the transition from waking awareness into the slow, natural drift of sleep. Ritual 29. Ending conversation the same way each night. People allowed talk to fade naturally rather than stopping it suddenly. As evening settled and the household moved toward rest, conversation did not end sharply. Instead, it followed a familiar pattern of softening and slowing. Words became fewer, sentences shortened, voices lowered without anyone needing to suggest it. This gradual fading was not planned, but it happened reliably each night. People spoke about ordinary things, small observations from the day, simple acknowledgments. Nothing important needed to be resolved at this time. Disagreements were avoided naturally, not through rules, but through habit. The night was not a place for new concerns. Pauses between words grew longer. Silence slipped in without discomfort. No one rushed to fill it. The absence of speech felt settled rather than empty. This allowed the mind to loosen its grip on alertness. Children noticed this change and adapted to it. They learned that night conversations were quieter and shorter. Over time, they followed the same rhythm as the adults. Speech slowed. Listening became passive. Words were no longer something to focus on. Eventually, conversation ended without announcement. Someone simply stopped speaking. Others did not respond. The silence remained. There was no sense of interruption. The ritual had completed itself. Afterward, people stayed still or prepared for rest. The calm created by the gentle end of conversation lingered. Thoughts softened. Attention drifted inward. By allowing conversation to fade the same way each night, medieval life avoided abrupt transitions. It arrived there naturally, guided by repetition and familiarity. This gentle closing of speech helped prepare the body and mind for sleep. making rest feel like a continuation rather than a sudden change. Ritual 30. Repeating the same final thoughts. People often ended the day by thinking the same familiar thoughts before sleep. As the household settled fully into night, many medieval people followed a quiet mental habit. Before sleep arrived, the mind returned to the same familiar thoughts it had visited many nights before. These thoughts were not chosen deliberately. They surfaced naturally, shaped by repetition and comfort. The thoughts were simple and unremarkable, remembering the day's work being finished, noticing the stillness of the room, acknowledging that nothing more was required until morning. There was no reviewing of worries or planning ahead. The purpose was not reflection, but closure. This mental repetition helped guide the mind away from alertness. By returning to the same thoughts night after night, the brain learned that these ideas signaled rest. Attention softened. Images became less detailed. The boundary between thinking and drifting grew thinner. Children developed this habit gradually. At first, their thoughts wandered freely. Over time, familiar patterns emerged. They learned what thinking felt like just before sleep. Adults rarely noticed the habit forming. It became automatic, like breathing, even when sleep did not come immediately. These repeated thoughts kept the mind from wandering too far. They acted as a gentle anchor. Nothing new entered awareness. The night remained predictable and calm. By ending each day with the same quiet mental rhythm, medieval life allowed sleep to approach naturally. The mind was not pushed into rest. It was guided there gently through familiarity and repetition. Thoughts slowed, awareness softened, and sleep arrived as a continuation of calm rather than a sudden shift. Ritual 31. Letting the room grow dark gradually. People allowed darkness to settle slowly rather than forcing it. As night deepened, medieval households did not rush to remove all light at once. Instead, they allowed the room to grow darker in stages. A candle might be left burning a little longer. The glow from the hearth embers might be allowed to fade naturally. This gradual dimming created a smooth transition into night. The change in light was gentle and predictable. Shadows lengthened slowly across familiar walls. Objects became less defined, not suddenly, but little by little. The eyes adjusted without effort. There was no moment that announced full darkness. It arrived quietly. This ritual helped the body understand that rest was approaching. Brightness encourages attention, but dim light invites stillness. By allowing light to fade slowly, people gave their senses time to relax. Movements became smaller. Breathing deepened. The room felt unclosed and safe. Children learned this rhythm early. They watched the light change and felt their energy soften along with it. Adults rarely thought about the process. They simply followed the pattern they had always known. The night unfolded the same way each time. Even sounds felt quieter as the room darkened. Voices softened. Activity slowed. The fading light encouraged a gentle pause in thought. Nothing new was expected of the night. Eventually, darkness settled fully. By then, the body was already prepared for rest. There was no adjustment needed. Sleep followed naturally. By repeating this slow dimming each night, medieval life avoided sudden shifts. The transition into darkness mirrored the transition into sleep. Both arrived gently, guided by patience, repetition, and the quiet acceptance of night. Ritual 32. Settling bedding in the same order. People prepared their sleeping space by adjusting bedding in a familiar sequence each night. As the final movements of the day faded, many medieval people followed a quiet routine centered on their bedding. This was not a task done differently each night. It unfolded in the same order, guided by habit rather than thought. Blankets were smoothed, covers were pulled into place. The surface where the body would rest was made familiar again. The movements were gentle and unhurried. Fabric was adjusted without snapping or shaking. Hands pressed lightly to remove folds. Each step followed the last in a sequence learned over time. There was no need to improve the process. Familiarity was more important than precision. This ritual helped signal that the body was nearing rest. By touching the bedding and arranging it calmly, people transitioned from movement into stillness. The tactile sensations were soft and grounding. The bed became a known space rather than something to think about. Children learned the order by watching. At first, they copied imperfectly. Over time, the same pattern emerged. Adults performed the ritual almost automatically, guided by memory rather than intention. The repetition reduced mental effort at the end of the day. Once the bedding was settled, there was no need to revisit it. The space was ready. The day felt complete. People lay down knowing nothing else required attention. By repeating this same preparation each night, medieval life created a dependable signal for rest. The body recognized the sequence and responded by slowing. Muscles loosened, breathing softened. Sleep arrived not as an interruption, but as a continuation of calm, shaped by routine and familiarity. Ritual 33. Resting hands in the same place. People allowed their hands to settle in a familiar position each night. As people lay down to rest, their hands naturally moved to the same place they had rested many nights before. This was not something consciously decided. The body remembered what felt familiar and returned to it without effort. Hands might rest on the chest, along the sides, or loosely folded. The position mattered less than the consistency. This quiet habit reduced movement. By settling the hands early, the body signaled that activity was finished. Muscles in the arms and shoulders softened. The urge to adjust faded gradually. Stillness became easier to maintain. The sleeping environment remained simple and unchanged, which supported this ritual. With fewer distractions, the body learned what to expect. Children developed this habit slowly, watching adults and copying their stillness. Over time, the position of rest became automatic, even when thoughts lingered. The stillness of the hands encouraged calm. Movement often keeps the mind alert. By limiting it, the body guided the mind toward rest. Breathing slowed naturally. Awareness softened. The repetition of this small habit created reassurance. Nothing new was required. The night would unfold as it always had. Hands remained still, anchoring the body in place. By repeating this same settling each night, medieval life created a gentle pathway into sleep. The body recognized the familiar signal and responded without resistance. Rest arrived quietly, supported by consistency and the absence of effort.
Ritual 35. Allowing thoughts to drift without following them. People noticed thoughts arise at night but did not pursue them. As the body grew still and the room settled into quiet, thoughts continued to appear in the mind. Medieval people did not try to stop this from happening. They also did not engage with those thoughts. Instead, they allowed them to pass through awareness without effort or reaction. A thought might appear briefly, a memory from the day, A simple image, a fragment of a conversation. These thoughts were not examined or expanded. They were noticed lightly and then allowed to fade on their own. No attempt was made to solve problems or plan ahead. Night was not considered the time for such work. This habit developed naturally through repetition. By experiencing night after night without acting on thoughts, the mind learned that thinking did not require response. Attention softened. The grip of awareness loosened. Thoughts became quieter and less defined. Children learned this without instruction. At first, their minds wandered freely. Over time, they noticed that stillness brought calm. Adults followed the same pattern, even if they could not describe it. The night trained the mind to release control. The absence of effort mattered. Trying to push thoughts away would create tension. Allowing them to drift required no energy. The body remained relaxed. Breathing stayed slow. Stillness deepened. Eventually, thoughts lost their shape. Images dissolved before forming fully. Awareness thinned. Sleep arrived quietly, without a clear moment of transition. By repeating this gentle non-response each night, medieval life allowed the mind to rest alongside the body. Sleep became a natural continuation of calm, guided by patience, familiarity, and the quiet understanding that nothing needed to be done. Ritual 36. Noticing the weight of the body on the bed. People became aware of their body settling without trying to change it. As the night continued and movement faded, attention naturally shifted to the feeling of the body resting where it lay. Medieval people did not analyze this sensation. They simply noticed it in a quiet, indirect way. The body felt heavier, not suddenly, but gradually, as muscles released their effort. The surface beneath them supported this change. Bedding, benches, or floor coverings pressed gently against the body. This pressure was familiar and steady. It did not demand attention. It encouraged stillness. Limbs sank slightly, finding their place without adjustment. This awareness helped anchor the body in rest. By feeling the weight settle, the mind received a clear signal that movement was no longer needed. There was no search for comfort. Comfort arrived through familiarity. The body knew where it belonged. Children experienced this sensation without questioning it. Adults recognized it without naming it. Over time, the body learned that this heaviness meant safety and rest. The sensation became associated with night and quiet. Breathing remained slow. Thoughts softened further. The sense of weight reduced the urge to shift or fidget. Stillness became easier to maintain. By allowing awareness to rest gently on the feeling of the body being supported, medieval life encouraged sleep without effort. The body did not need instruction. It followed gravity and repetition. Rest deepened naturally, guided by the quiet certainty that nothing more was required. Ritual 37. Letting sounds fade into the background. People allowed familiar noises to lose importance as the night progressed. As night settled fully, sounds continued to exist, but their meaning changed. Medieval people heard the same noises each evening: wind moving, wood settling, distant animals. These sounds were not interpreted or questioned. They were allowed to blend together and fade into the background. Listening did not require attention. The ears remained open, but the mind did not attach importance to what was heard. A sound might appear briefly, then disappear. No effort was made to track it. This passive listening reduced alertness. Children learned this slowly. At first, noises captured their focus. Over time, repetition taught them that these sounds were harmless and expected. Adults rarely noticed the transition. It happened naturally. As sounds lost importance, silence felt deeper. Even when noise remained, the mind stopped reacting. The body remained relaxed. Breathing stayed even. This habit helped prevent sudden wakefulness. By not assigning meaning to sound, the night remained calm. Nothing required response. By allowing sounds to exist without attention, medieval life created a restful auditory environment. Sleep arrived alongside sound, not in opposition to it. Awareness softened, and rest followed quietly. Ritual 38. Remaining physically still even while awake. People stayed in the same position even if sleep had not yet arrived. There were many nights when sleep did not come immediately. Medieval people did not treat this as a problem that needed solving. When wakefulness lingered, the body was allowed to remain still. Movement was not used to chase comfort. Stillness itself was considered enough. Once settled, the body stayed where it was. Arms remained in place. Legs were not repositioned repeatedly. The surface beneath the body was accepted as it was. This lack of adjustment reduced stimulation. Muscles were not re-engaged. The nervous system stayed calm. This habit developed slowly through repetition. Children learned it by observing adults who did not toss or turn. Over time, the body learned that staying still was safe. Wakefulness no longer triggered restlessness. Even alertness became quieter. Thoughts might continue briefly, but without movement, they softened more easily. Breathing remained slow and even. The absence of physical change discouraged mental activity. The body sent a clear signal that effort had ended. There was no frustration attached to being awake. Time was not measured. The night was allowed to unfold at its own pace. Stillness was not forced. It was simply maintained. Eventually, awareness thinned. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurred. Sleep arrived without a clear moment of transition. By remaining physically still even during wakefulness, medieval life removed urgency from rest. The body did not struggle towards sleep. It waited quietly, supported by familiarity, patience, and the understanding that rest would arrive on its own.
Ritual 34. Breathing slowing without effort. People allowed their breathing to settle naturally as the night deepened. As rest approached, medieval people did not try to control their breathing. There were no instructions to follow and no techniques to remember. Instead, breathing slowed on its own as the body became still. This change happened gradually and without attention, guided by the quiet of the surroundings and the absence of movement. At first, breaths remained similar to those taken during the day. Then, without effort, they lengthened. The pause between breaths grew slightly wider. The chest rose and fell with less urgency. This shift was subtle enough that it often went unnoticed, yet it played an important role in preparing the body for sleep. The environment supported this process. The room was dim. Sounds were minimal. There was no reason for alertness. As the body recognized safety and stillness, breathing followed suit. Each breath required less energy. Muscles around the ribs and shoulders softened naturally. Children experienced this change instinctively. They did not think about breathing. They simply lay still, and their bodies adjusted. Adults followed the same pattern, even if they were unaware of it. Over time, the body learned that night brought slower rhythms. Even when thoughts drifted, the steady pace of breathing kept the body calm. The breath acted as a quiet anchor, preventing sudden movement or tension. There was no need to reach for sleep. It approached on its own. By allowing breathing to slow naturally each night, medieval life supported rest without force. The body transitioned smoothly from wakefulness into sleep, guided by stillness, repetition, and the quiet acceptance of night. Ritual 39. Letting wakefulness exist without judgment. People allowed themselves to be awake at night without labeling it as a problem. During the night, there were moments when sleep did not arrive right away. Medieval people did not interpret this wakefulness as failure or disruption. Being awake was simply another state the body passed through. It did not require correction. This attitude developed naturally in a world without constant timekeeping or pressure to perform the next day. When awareness remained, it was allowed to remain. The mind did not argue with itself about why sleep had not come yet. There was no effort to force drowsiness or to push thoughts away aggressively. Wakefulness was treated as neutral, neither good nor bad. This lack of judgment reduced tension. Without frustration, the body stayed relaxed. Muscles remained soft. Breathing stayed slow. The nervous system did not receive a signal that something was wrong. Because of this, wakefulness often softened on its own. Children experienced this easily. If they were awake, they lay quietly. Adults followed the same pattern, shaped by repetition rather than intention. Over time, the body learned that calm wakefulness naturally leads to sleep when it is ready. Thoughts drifted in and out without urgency. Attention did not sharpen. Awareness gradually thinned. The absence of pressure made rest more accessible. By allowing wakefulness to exist without judgment, medieval life removed one of the main barriers to sleep. Night did not demand unconsciousness on a schedule. It offered rest when the body was ready. This acceptance created a gentle path towards sleep, guided by patience, familiarity, and the quiet understanding that nothing needed to be fixed. Ritual 40. Allowing sleep to arrive without watching for it. People rested without checking whether sleep had begun. As the night progressed, medieval people did not monitor themselves to see if they were falling asleep. There was no habit of checking awareness or asking whether rest had started. Attention was not turned inward in that way. Instead, the body was allowed to remain quiet without supervision. Once stillness had been established, there was nothing more to do. The mind did not wait for a specific moment. There was no effort to notice changes or to mark the transition from waking to sleeping. This absence of observation mattered. Watching for sleep often delays it. Letting go allowed it to arrive naturally. Thoughts became less structured without being pushed away. Images softened. Awareness loosened gradually. The mind was not engaged in judging its own state. Because of this, the boundary between waking and sleeping remained undefined. Children experienced this easily. They did not look for sleep. They simply lay still until it came. Adults followed the same pattern, shaped by repetition rather than instruction. Over time, the body learned that sleep does not need to be invited or checked on. Breathing stayed slow. Muscles remained relaxed. Stillness continued without effort. Nothing changed suddenly. There was no moment that needed to be noticed. By allowing sleep to arrive without watching for it, medieval life avoided one of the most common sources of nighttime tension. Rest was not something to achieve. It was something that happened when conditions were calm. Sleep arrived quietly, supported by patience, familiarity, and the understanding that nothing needed to be done. Ritual 41. letting the mind empty without forcing silence. People allowed thoughts to thin out naturally rather than trying to stop them. As the night continued and the body remained still, the mind did not suddenly become silent. Medieval people did not expect it to. Instead, they allowed thoughts to appear less frequently on their own. There was no attempt to push the mind into emptiness. Silence was not forced. It arrived gradually. At first, small thoughts might still surface. A simple image, a fragment of a memory. These were not followed or expanded. They were noticed briefly and then allowed to fade. Over time, the gaps between thoughts grew wider. The mind became quieter without effort. This process felt gentle rather than controlled. There was no strain involved. By not reacting to thoughts, the mind learned that it did not need to stay active. Awareness softened naturally. Attention became diffuse rather than focused. Children experienced this easily. Their thoughts drifted without structure as they lay still. Adults developed the same habit through repetition. The night itself taught the mind how to let go. Breathing remained slow and even. The body stayed relaxed. As mental activity reduced, physical tension eased further. The sense of self-awareness became less sharp. There was no need to notice this change. It happened quietly in the background. Eventually, the mind reached a state where thoughts were rare and faint. There was no clear boundary marking this moment. It did not matter whether it was noticed or not. Sleep approached gently from this state of openness, by allowing the mind to empty without forcing silence. Medieval life supported rest in a patient way. The mind was not commanded to stop. It was simply given permission to slow down, guided by stillness, familiarity, and the quiet rhythm of the night. Ritual 42. Trusting stillness to do the work. People remained still and allowed rest to deepen on its own. As the night settled further, medieval people did not search for techniques or actions to bring rest. Once stillness had been reached, they trusted it. The body had already been placed in a familiar position. Movement had faded. The environment was quiet and unchanged. Nothing more was required. Stillness was not treated as something fragile. It did not need to be protected or adjusted. People allowed it to exist fully. Muscles stayed relaxed without effort. The body did not check itself for tension. It simply remained where it was. This trust developed over time. By experiencing many nights where rest follows stillness, the body learned a quiet lesson. Doing nothing was enough. There was no need to intervene. Wakefulness did not require correction. Stillness alone guided the transition. Children absorbed this naturally. They lay quietly without expectation. Adults followed the same pattern, shaped by years of repetition. The night became familiar territory rather than something to manage. Breathing continued slowly. The space between breaths lengthened slightly. Sensations softened. The boundary between awareness and rest grew thin. No attention was placed on this change. It did not need observation. Eventually, awareness loosened further. Thoughts became distant. Sensation faded into background presence. Sleep did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded quietly from stillness itself. By trusting stillness to do the work, medieval life removed effort from rest. Sleep was not an action to perform. It was a natural result of calm conditions. The body and mind were allowed to settle together, guided by patience, familiarity, and the quiet certainty that nothing more needed to be done. Ritual 43. Allowing awareness to soften without holding onto it. People did not try to maintain awareness as sleep approached. As rest deepened, medieval people did not attempt to stay aware of their surroundings. They also did not try to lose awareness deliberately. Instead, they allowed awareness itself to soften naturally. Attention loosened its grip without being released forcefully. The mind did not hold onto wakefulness, and it did not chase sleep. At first, awareness remained broad. The body could still be felt resting. Sounds still existed faintly. The room was still known without being examined. Over time, these impressions grew less distinct. Sensations blurred gently rather than disappearing all at once. This softening happened without effort. No part of the body was asked to relax. No thought was asked to leave. Awareness simply became less defined as stillness continued. The mind did not resist this change. It allowed it to unfold. Children experienced this transition easily. They did not try to remain alert. Adults learned the same pattern through repetition. The night itself taught them that awareness does not need guarding. Breathing remained slow and regular. Muscles stayed loose. The sense of being present became lighter. There was no point at which this shift needed to be noticed. Observation itself faded along with everything else. Eventually, awareness thinned to the point where it could no longer be followed. Sleep emerged from this softness without announcement. There was no moment of decision. By allowing awareness to soften without holding on to it, medieval life removed the final barrier between wakefulness and sleep. Rest was not reached by effort or intention. It arrived quietly, supported by patience, repetition, and the acceptance that awareness itself could gently fade. Ritual 44. Letting the sense of time dissolve. People allowed the feeling of time to fade as rest deepened. As the night continued and stillness held, medieval people did not keep track of how long they had been lying awake. The sense of time gradually loosened on its own. Minutes were not counted. Hours were not imagined. Once rest began, time stopped being something that needed awareness. At first, the body might still have some sense of sequence. The day felt finished. Night had begun. Beyond that, there was no need to know more. As stillness continued, even that loose structure faded. The mind stopped marking progression. There was only the present moment, quiet and unchanging. This was not something people tried to achieve. It happened naturally when nothing demanded attention. Without clocks nearby, and without habits of checking, time simply lost importance. The night did not feel long or short. It simply existed. Children experienced this easily. They did not wonder how long sleep would take. Adults followed the same pattern, shaped by repetition rather than intention. Over time, the body learned that the absence of time awareness was safe. Breathing remained slow. Sensations softened further. Thoughts appeared less often and carried no urgency. Without time to move toward, the mind had no direction to follow. Awareness rested without focus. Eventually, the feeling of time dissolved almost completely. There was no waiting. There was no arrival. Sleep emerged quietly from this timeless state. By allowing the sense of time to fade, medieval life removed one of the last sources of nighttime tension. Rest was no longer something expected in the future. It became part of the present moment, unfolding gently, supported by stillness, familiarity, and the quiet release of measurement. Ritual 45. Letting the body forget its edges. People allowed the clear sense of where the body began and ended to soften. As stillness continued and the night remained quiet, Medieval people often noticed that the sharp awareness of their body began to fade. This was not something they aimed for. It happened naturally when movement had stopped and attention was no longer focused on sensation. The body rested, and its boundaries became less distinct. At first, the body was felt clearly: the weight of limbs, the surface beneath them, the position of the head and hands. Over time, these sensations softened. They did not disappear suddenly. They blurred gently, as if the body were spreading into the space around it. This change required no effort. Muscles were already relaxed. Breathing was slow and steady, with nothing drawing attention back to the physical form. The mind stopped mapping the body so precisely. The sense of edges became less important. Children experienced this easily. They did not think about where their body ended. Adults learned the same state through repetition. Night after night, the body taught itself that it did not need constant awareness to remain safe. As the sense of physical boundaries softened, tension released further. There was less urge to adjust or move. Stillness felt natural rather than imposed. The body rested fully within its space. Thoughts became faint and infrequent. Sensation turned diffuse. There was no need to notice this transition. Awareness did not cling to form. It loosened quietly. Eventually, the body felt present without being defined. Sleep emerged from this state without effort. There was no clear moment when one state became another. By allowing the body to forget its edges, medieval life supported deep rest without instruction or force. The body and mind drifted together into sleep, guided by stillness, familiarity, and the quiet comfort of letting go. Ritual 46. Letting the sense of self grow quiet. People allowed personal awareness to soften without holding onto identity. As rest deepened and awareness continued to loosen, medieval people did not actively think about themselves. The sense of being an individual with responsibilities and concerns gradually softened. This was not a deliberate act. It happened naturally as attention drifted away from thought and sensation. At first, there might still be a quiet sense of presence, a feeling of existing in the room. Over time, even that softened. The mind stopped referencing the self. There was no internal commentary, no need to define who was resting or why. Awareness became simple and unstructured. This shift required no effort. The body was already still. Breathing remained slow and even, without movement or thought. The mind had nothing to organize around. Identity loosened without resistance. Children experienced this state easily. They did not maintain a sense of self while falling asleep. Adults returned to it through repetition. The night provided a space where identity was not required. As the sense of self faded, rest deepened further. There was no concern about past or future. There was no role to maintain. Awareness existed without direction. Eventually, even this minimal awareness thinned. Sleep emerged quietly from this simplicity. There was no clear boundary where identity ended and sleep began. Ritual 47. Allowing time to lose its shape. People let the sense of passing time slowly dissolve. As the night stretched on and nothing required attention, medieval people often stopped noticing time altogether. This was not because time had ended, but because it no longer needed to be tracked. There were no clocks nearby, no glowing numbers, no reason to measure minutes or hours while lying still in the dark. At first, there might have been a vague sense of how long one had been resting. That awareness softened naturally, without movement or activity. The mind had no markers to hold on to. One moment felt similar to the next. Time stopped feeling like a line and became more like a wide, quiet space. Breathing continued at its own pace, slow, even, unconcerned with duration. The body did not count breaths. It simply followed its rhythm, with no reference points. The mind stopped estimating how long rest had lasted or how much night remained. This was familiar, not unsettling. Night after night, the same pattern occurred. Darkness arrived. Stillness followed. Sleep came without needing to be scheduled. Time was trusted rather than monitored. As the sense of time dissolved, impatience disappeared. There was no waiting for sleep to happen, no concern about when morning would arrive. Rest existed without urgency. Thoughts that depended on time lost their structure. Plans, memories, and expectations required sequencing. Without a sense of sequence, these thoughts faded. Awareness became unmeasured and loose. Eventually, even the idea of duration vanished. There was no sense of before or after. Sleep emerged quietly from this timeless state. By allowing time to lose its shape, medieval rest became effortless. The night did not need to be managed. It simply held the body and mind until sleep arrived on its own, calm and unforced. Ritual 48. Letting attention drift without direction. People allowed awareness to move freely without choosing where it should go. As rest continued and nothing demanded focus, attention no longer stayed fixed on any single thing. Medieval people did not try to concentrate. They also did not try to distract themselves. Awareness was allowed to drift in a slow, unstructured way, moving gently without purpose. At first, attention might rest on the sound of breathing. Then it might shift to the quiet of the room. After that, it could settle briefly on a faint sensation, like warmth or the weight of cloth. These shifts were not intentional. They happened naturally, without effort or control, because there was no task to complete. Attention did not linger for long. It moved the way water moves across a flat surface, slowly, calmly, without resistance. Nothing needed to be examined closely. Nothing needed to be held. This wandering attention felt safe because the environment was familiar. The same room, the same night sounds, the same routine. There was no danger in letting awareness loosen its grip. As attention drifted, thinking slowed. Thoughts could not build momentum without sustained focus. They appeared briefly and then faded, replaced by silence or sensation. The mind did not follow them. Children experienced this state easily. Adults returned to it through repetition. Night after night, the body learned that attention did not need direction in order to rest. Over time, even drifting became less noticeable. Awareness thinned. It did not attach to sound or sensation. It floated without anchoring itself anywhere. Eventually, attention dissolved into sleep without a clear transition. There was no moment of decision, no final thought. Rest simply deepened. By letting attention drift without direction, medieval people allowed sleep to arrive naturally. Nothing was forced. Nothing was managed. Awareness softened, loosened, and gently disappeared into rest. Ritual 49. Allowing the night to hold awareness. People trusted the surrounding darkness to carry their remaining attention. As awareness became faint and unfocused, medieval people did not try to keep it active. Instead, they allowed the night itself to hold what little attention remained. Darkness was familiar. It did not feel empty or threatening. It felt stable and continuous. The room was already known. Shapes no longer needed to be identified. The absence of light removed the need to observe. With nothing visible to track, awareness rested outward rather than inward. Breathing continued softly. Sounds were minimal and predictable. A distant movement, a quiet settling of wood or fabric. These sounds did not pull attention. They supported it, reminding the mind that everything was steady. There was no effort to stay aware. There was also no attempt to fall asleep. Awareness simply rested, supported by the night. The darkness did not demand anything. It did not change suddenly. It remained the same moment after moment. This allowed the mind to stop monitoring itself. There was no internal check to see if sleep was happening. That question no longer arose. Without self-monitoring, awareness thinned naturally. Thoughts lost their structure. Sensations lost their edges. What remained was a quiet presence, lightly held by the surrounding stillness. Over time, even this presence softened. Awareness did not disappear abruptly. It faded gradually, like a sound becoming more distant. Sleep emerged from this state without notice. There was no boundary to cross. The night carried awareness gently until it was no longer needed. By allowing the night to hold awareness, medieval rest became complete and effortless. Darkness was not resisted or examined. It was trusted, and within that trust, sleep arrived calmly and without strain. Ritual 50. Letting thoughts fade without resolution. People allowed unfinished thoughts to remain unfinished. As the night deepened, medieval people did not try to complete their thoughts. Ideas that surfaced were not followed to conclusions. Questions were not answered. Memories were not organized. The mind was allowed to leave things open. A thought might appear briefly, something ordinary, a task remembered, a small detail from the day. Instead of continuing, the thought was left alone. It was not pushed away, and it was not explored. It simply remained incomplete, and then softened. This was familiar. Many parts of daily life were unresolved at night. Work paused. Conversations ended. The world itself rested. The mind followed the same pattern. Without pressure to resolve anything, thinking slowed naturally. Thoughts depended on momentum. Without attention, they could not continue. They faded quietly, one by one. There was no discomfort in leaving things unfinished. Morning would return clarity. Night did not require answers. This understanding reduced mental effort. Breathing remained steady. The body stayed still, with no need to think something through. Tension did not rebuild. The mind did not tighten around problems. Children experienced this easily. Adults relearned it through repetition. Each night taught the same lesson. Nothing needed closure in order to rest. As thoughts lost urgency, space opened between them. Silence appeared more often. When a thought did surface, it felt distant and brief. Eventually, even the habit of thinking weakened. The mind rested in pauses rather than ideas. Awareness became soft and undirected. Sleep arrived from this openness without announcement. There was no final thought to release. Rest deepened simply because nothing was being held. By letting thoughts fade without resolution, medieval rest remained uncomplicated. The mind was not required to finish the day. It was allowed to pause mid-sentence and drift calmly into sleep. Ritual 51. Allowing awareness to become distant. People let their sense of being present move farther away. As rest deepened, medieval people often noticed that awareness no longer felt close or sharp. It did not stay centered in the body or the mind. Instead, it began to feel distant, as if it were gently moving away without leaving completely. At first, awareness might still notice breathing or stillness. Over time, even that felt far away. Sensations were no longer immediate. They existed, but without urgency or detail. The body was present, yet not closely observed. This distancing did not cause concern. It was familiar and expected. Night after night, the same soft withdrawal occurred. Awareness learned that it did not need to remain near the surface. Sounds became less distinct. A noise might occur, but it felt far off and unimportant. The mind did not move toward it. Attention stayed loose and remote. Breathing continued on its own. The body required no supervision, with awareness no longer hovering nearby. Tension did not return. Muscles remained relaxed. Stillness felt natural. Thoughts, when they appeared, felt distant as well. They did not feel personal or urgent. They passed without pulling attention closer. The mind did not follow them. This state was not empty. It was gentle and quiet. Awareness existed without closeness, like watching something from far away without interest in details. Over time, even the sense of distance softened. Awareness did not need to move farther. It simply thinned. Presence became faint. Sleep emerged without interruption. There was no moment when awareness fully disappeared. It faded quietly, already far enough away to no longer matter. By allowing awareness to become distant, medieval rest unfolded smoothly. Nothing was forced. Nothing was monitored. Awareness drifted back naturally, leaving sleep to settle in fully and without effort. Ritual 52. Letting the mind stop checking for sleep. People allowed the habit of monitoring rest to quietly fall away. As the night continued, medieval people did not ask themselves whether they were asleep yet. That question simply did not arise. There was no habit of checking progress or measuring rest. The mind did not look inward to evaluate its own state. At first, awareness might still have noticed stillness or calm. Over time, even that awareness stopped being examined. The mind no longer checked breathing. It did not ask whether thoughts were slowing. There was no internal observation happening. This absence of monitoring created ease. When nothing is being checked, nothing needs to change. The body was already resting. The mind had no task to perform. Without evaluation, tension did not return. Night after night, this pattern repeated. Darkness arrived. Stillness followed. Sleep came when it came. There was no strategy involved. This made rest reliable rather than fragile. When thoughts appeared, they were not assessed. There was no concern about thinking too much. The mind did not label states as good or bad. It allowed everything to exist briefly and then pass. Breathing continued without attention. The body required no supervision, with no inner observer watching for results. Relaxation deepened naturally. Eventually, the idea of falling asleep was no longer present. Awareness rested without goal. There was nothing to wait for. Sleep arrived quietly from this neutrality. It did not feel earned or triggered. It simply happened when monitoring had fully dissolved. By letting the mind stop checking for sleep, medieval rest became effortless. Nothing needed to be confirmed. The absence of checking allowed rest to complete itself gently, and without interference. Ritual 53. Allowing silence to feel full rather than empty. People experience quiet as something complete, not something missing. As sound faded and movement ceased, medieval people did not experience silence as a lack. Quiet was not empty space waiting to be filled. It felt whole on its own, steady and sufficient. The absence of noise did not create expectation. There was no urge for sound to return. Silence felt like a stable presence, surrounding and supporting rest. This perception came from familiarity. Nights were often quiet. Silence was not rare. It did not signal danger or absence. It signaled continuity, with no sound demanding attention. The mind had nothing to track. Awareness did not search for stimulation. It rested naturally within the quiet. Breathing blended into the silence. Even internal sounds lost definition. The mind did not isolate them. Everything merged into a soft background. Thoughts appeared less frequently in this fullness. Silence did not invite thinking. It did not feel like a gap needing to be filled. It felt complete as it was. Children accepted this easily. Adults relearned it through repetition. Silence became trusted rather than questioned. As silence felt fuller, awareness softened further. There was nothing missing, nothing to anticipate, nothing to wait for. Sleep emerged smoothly from this completeness. There was no transition marked by change. Quiet simply deepened until awareness faded. By allowing silence to feel full rather than empty, medieval rest remained uncomplicated. The mind did not resist quiet. It settled into it, and sleep followed without effort. Ritual 54. Letting familiarity replace attention. People relied on what was already known instead of staying alert. As the night settled and rest deepened, medieval people did not keep paying close attention to their surroundings. They did not need to. The room was familiar. The bed was familiar. The night itself followed patterns that had repeated countless times before. Because everything was known, attention was no longer required. There was no scanning of the space, no quiet listening for changes. Familiarity carried the experience without effort. The body recognized the surface beneath it, the weight of cloth, the shape of stillness. None of these needed to be noticed consciously. They were already understood. This allowed the mind to loosen further. When something is familiar, it does not demand focus. It does not need to be checked or confirmed. The mind trusted the environment to remain stable. Breathing continued quietly. Sounds, if they appeared, fit into expectation. They did not trigger alertness. They were part of the known rhythm of night. Thoughts slowed because attention was no longer needed anywhere. There was nothing new to observe, nothing to interpret, nothing to respond to. This state felt safe. Familiarity removed uncertainty. Without uncertainty, awareness had no reason to stay sharp. It softened naturally. As familiarity carried the experience, awareness faded without resistance. The mind rested on what it already knew, without actively knowing it. Sleep emerged gently from this trust. There was no moment of letting go. Familiarity had already done the work. By letting familiarity replace attention, medieval rest unfolded smoothly. The night required no vigilance. Everything was already understood well enough for sleep to arrive. Ritual 55. Allowing the body to rest without instruction. People trusted the body to rest on its own. During the night, medieval people did not tell their bodies how to relax. They did not guide breathing. They did not release muscles deliberately. The body already knew what to do when movement stopped. Stillness was enough. Once activity ended, the body naturally shifted into rest. Muscles softened gradually. Breathing slowed without effort. The body followed its own rhythm. There was no sense of managing physical comfort. Small adjustments happened early. After that, the body settled and stayed settled. It did not require further input. This trust reduced mental effort. When the body was not being directed, the mind did not need to supervise it. Awareness stepped back naturally. Breathing became quiet and even. The body maintained itself without attention. Any remaining tension faded slowly, not because it was released intentionally, but because it was no longer supported by movement or thought. The body had learned this pattern through repetition. Night after night, the same process occurred. Stillness led to rest. Rest led to sleep. As the body rested fully on its own, awareness thinned further. Sensations softened. The physical form became less distinct. Sleep arrived from this autonomy without effort. The body did not need permission to sleep. It simply did. By allowing the body to rest without instruction, medieval nights remained uncomplicated. Nothing was controlled. Nothing was guided. The body did what it had always known how to do, and sleep followed quietly. Ritual 56. Letting stillness become normal. People allowed unmoving silence to feel ordinary rather than noticeable. As the night progressed and the body remained at rest, medieval people did not continue to notice their own stillness. At first, the lack of movement might have been clear. The body was lying quietly. Limbs were no longer shifting. Breathing was slow. Over time, this stillness stopped standing out. When nothing changes for long enough, it becomes normal. The body did not feel frozen or restrained. It felt settled. Stillness was no longer an action. It was simply the state the body was in. This made rest easier. When stillness is noticed, it can invite adjustment. When it becomes ordinary, there is no reason to move. The body remained comfortable without effort. Breathing blended into this stillness. Each breath was similar to the last. There was no reason to track it. The body continued quietly on its own. The mind followed the same pattern. At first, it might have noticed the quiet. Later, the quiet stopped being something to notice. It became the background of experience. Thoughts appeared less frequently because nothing disturbed the calm. There was no change to respond to, no new sensation to evaluate. The mind rested within sameness. This familiarity was reassuring. The absence of movement did not signal alertness or tension. It signaled safety and continuity. As stillness became normal, awareness loosened further. There was nothing to focus on and nothing to avoid. Attention did not cling anywhere. Sleep emerged naturally from this ordinary quiet. There was no transition marked by effort or decision. Stillness had already prepared the way. By letting stillness become normal, medieval rest deepened without interference. The body and mind accepted quiet as the default state of night, and sleep followed without resistance. Ritual 57. Allowing the night to continue without comment. People stopped narrating their experience as the hours passed. As rest settled in, medieval people did not describe the night to themselves. There was no internal commentary about how quiet it was, how dark it felt, or how calm the body had become. The habit of describing experience faded. Early in rest, the mind might still label things: comfortable, quiet, still. Over time, even these simple words stopped forming. Experience no longer needed explanation. This absence of narration reduced mental activity. Without words forming, thoughts lost structure. The mind did not turn sensations into stories. It allowed them to exist without translation. Breathing continued without being named. Stillness remained without being observed. The body rested without being described. This was not forced silence. It was a natural result of nothing needing to be communicated. There was no audience, no reason to summarize the moment. As inner narration stopped, awareness softened further. The mind no longer stood apart from experience. It rested within it quietly. Thoughts that relied on language faded first. Planning, remembering, and evaluating required words. Without narration, these processes slowed and then paused. What remained was simple presence without commentary. The night did not need to be explained to be trusted. It continued steadily on its own. Eventually, even this wordless presence thinned. Awareness did not need to say anything more. There was nothing left to add. Sleep arrived quietly from this silence of description. There was no final thought to finish. The night continued without comment, and rest deepened into sleep naturally and without effort. Ritual 58. Letting sensations blend together. People allowed individual sensations to lose separation. As rest deepened, medieval people did not keep sensations distinct. Early in the night, the body might notice separate feelings, the weight of limbs, the surface beneath them, the warmth of coverings. Over time, these sensations stopped standing apart. Instead of being felt individually, they blended into a single, soft experience. There was no clear boundary between warmth and pressure, or between the body and what supported it. Everything merged gradually. This blending reduced mental activity. Distinction required attention. Without attention, sensations naturally softened and combined. The mind did not sort or label what the body felt. Breathing became part of this blend. It was no longer felt as a movement. It was simply part of the overall quiet presence of the body. Sounds, if present, also blended into the background. They did not interrupt. They joined the steady field of experience without pulling focus. This merging felt comfortable. There was no sharpness, no contrast. The body rested within a uniform calm. Thoughts appeared less frequently because they had nothing distinct to attach to. Without clear sensation, attention did not anchor itself anywhere. As sensations continued to blend, awareness loosened further. The sense of physical form became diffuse. The body felt present without detail. Sleep arrived quietly from this softness. There was no shift from one sensation to another. Everything had already merged into calm. By letting sensations blend together, medieval rest remained gentle and unbroken. The body did not hold itself apart from its surroundings. It softened into them, and sleep followed without effort. Ritual 59. Allowing the body to feel heavy without resistance. People accepted the natural weight of rest. As the body remained still, medieval people often felt a growing heaviness. This was not a strain. It was the simple result of muscles fully releasing. The body settled into its support without holding itself up. At first, this weight might have been noticed. Limbs felt grounded. The body pressed more firmly into the surface beneath it. Over time, even this heaviness stopped being observed. There was no attempt to feel lighter. no effort to shift or adjust. The weight was accepted as part of rest. This acceptance prevented tension from returning. When heaviness was allowed, muscles did not re-engage. The body remained settled. Breathing continued easily despite the weight. The chest rose and fell without effort. The body managed itself. The mind followed this acceptance. It did not interpret heaviness as something to correct. It recognized it as a sign of rest. As the body felt heavier, awareness became more distant. The sense of effort disappeared. The body felt supported rather than active. Thoughts slowed because there was no energy pushing them forward. Everything moved toward stillness. Sleep emerged quietly from this grounded state. There was no sensation of falling asleep. The body simply remained heavy and still until awareness faded. By allowing the body to feel heavy without resistance, medieval rest deepened naturally. Weight was not something to overcome. It was a signal that the body had fully settled into the night, ready for sleep. Ritual 60. Letting the mind stop anticipating morning. People allow the idea of waking to drift out of awareness. As the night continued, medieval people did not think ahead to morning. They did not imagine what would come next. The idea of waking, moving, or beginning the day slowly lost relevance. Night was allowed to exist on its own, without being connected to what followed it. Early in rest, the mind might still have held a loose sense of the next day. Tasks, duties, familiar routines. Over time, these thoughts softened. Without light or activity, the future had no shape to hold on to. The body did not prepare itself for waking. It did not stay partially alert. Muscles remained fully released. Breathing stayed slow and even, unconcerned with what came later. This absence of anticipation reduced mental tension. When the mind is waiting for something, it stays active. When nothing is expected, it can rest completely. Thoughts about time ahead required structure. Without structure, they faded. The mind stayed with the present quiet rather than projecting forward. Children slipped into this easily. Adults relearned it through repetition. Night after night, the same lesson returned. Morning would arrive without being watched. As anticipation dissolved, awareness softened further. There was no internal readiness, no subtle alertness. The mind did not hover near the surface. Sleep emerged naturally from this lack of expectation. There was no sense of crossing from night into sleep. Night simply continued until awareness was no longer present. By letting the mind stop anticipating morning, medieval rest became deeper and uninterrupted. The future was not held in thought. The night was allowed to remain complete on its own, carrying the body gently into sleep. Ritual 61. Allowing rest to feel sufficient. People accepted the moment as already complete. As stillness continued and awareness grew faint, medieval people did not feel that anything more was needed. Rest did not feel like a process still underway. It felt sufficient as it was. There was no sense of waiting for deeper calm, no measuring of how relaxed the body felt. The present state was accepted without comparison. This acceptance reduced effort completely. When rest feels incomplete, the mind tries to improve it. When it feels sufficient, there is nothing to adjust. The body remained still without instruction. Breathing flowed quietly. Sensations stayed soft and blended. Nothing called for change. Thoughts appeared rarely because there was no dissatisfaction to generate them. The mind did not ask whether it was resting correctly. It did not seek a different state. This feeling of sufficiency was gentle and stable. It did not create excitement or relief. It simply removed the need for striving. Awareness rested lightly within this completeness. There was no pressure to move forward, no reason to hold back. As the sense of sufficiency remained, awareness thinned naturally. The mind did not cling to the moment. It did not need to preserve it. Sleep arrived quietly from this completeness. There was no improvement or deepening to notice. Rest had already been enough. By allowing rest to feel sufficient, medieval nights remained calm and unforced. Nothing needed to be added or achieved. The moment held everything required for sleep to arrive on its own. Ritual 62. Letting the night feel endless. People allowed the night to exist without an imagined ending. As rest continued and awareness remained soft, medieval people did not think of the night as something that would soon be over. There was no sense of counting down, no quiet awareness of how much darkness remained. The night was allowed to feel wide and unbroken, without clocks or markers. The night did not move forward in a noticeable way. One moment felt much like the next. This sameness removed urgency. There was no pressure for sleep to happen quickly, because the night did not feel limited. Breathing stayed slow and steady. The body did not hold itself in readiness. Muscles remained loose, unprepared for movement. The idea of transition faded. Thoughts about endings required time awareness. Without that awareness, thoughts had nowhere to go. The mind did not anticipate change. It rested within the steady continuation of darkness. This feeling was not boredom. It was spacious and calm. The night did not need to progress toward anything. It simply existed, holding the body and mind without demand. As the night felt endless, awareness loosened further. There was no mental marker saying something should happen next. Attention did not hover. Sleep emerged quietly from this openness. There was no moment of arrival. The night simply continued while awareness faded. By letting the night feel endless, medieval rest lost all urgency. There was nothing to reach, nothing to miss. The mind drifted naturally into sleep, carried by the sense that the night was wide enough to hold it without effort. Ritual 63. Allowing the mind to stop noticing itself. People let self-awareness dissolve without comment. As rest deepened, medieval people did not remain aware that they were resting. The mind stopped observing its own state. There was no sense of watching thoughts slow or sensations fade. Early on, the mind might still have noticed calm. Later, even this noticing disappeared. Awareness did not turn back on itself. It rested without reflection. This reduced mental activity further. Self-observation required effort. Without it, the mind became simple and quiet. Breathing continued without being felt. Stillness remained without being noticed. The body rested without supervision. Thoughts appeared less frequently because there was no observer to engage with them. They passed without recognition. This state felt natural, not empty. The mind did not disappear. It stopped commenting. As self-noticing faded, awareness thinned smoothly. There was no final point of awareness to release. Sleep arrived without being recognized. There was no awareness left to notice the change. By allowing the mind to stop noticing itself, medieval rest completed itself quietly. The night did not need to be experienced. It simply continued, and within that continuation, sleep took over gently and without effort. Ritual 64. Letting comfort become unremarkable. People allowed comfort to exist without drawing attention to it. As the body remained settled and the night stayed quiet, medieval people did not focus on feeling comfortable. Comfort was present, but it was not highlighted or examined. It did not need to be noticed to continue. Early in rest, the body might still register ease, the absence of strain, the lack of pressure. Over time, even this recognition faded. Comfort became the background rather than the subject. This reduced mental activity further. Noticing comfort can sometimes invite comparison. Is it enough? Could it be better? Without noticing, these questions never formed. The body remained supported. Muscles stayed loose. Breathing stayed slow. Comfort continued without supervision. The mind did not hold on to pleasant sensation. It did not try to preserve it. Comfort existed quietly, without being claimed or measured. This allowed awareness to soften further. When nothing stands out as good or bad, attention has no reason to remain active. It rests naturally. Thoughts appeared rarely because nothing prompted them. There was no discomfort to fix and no pleasure to analyze. As comfort remained unremarkable, awareness thinned. The body felt present without detail. The mind rested without engagement. Sleep emerged smoothly from this neutrality. There was no moment of drifting from comfort into sleep. Comfort simply continued while awareness faded. By letting comfort become unremarkable, medieval rest stayed effortless. Nothing needed to be enjoyed or improved. The body and mind rested within quiet ease until sleep arrived naturally. Ritual 65. Allowing awareness to settle into the background. People let awareness move from center stage to the edges. As the night continued and nothing changed, awareness no longer stayed at the center of experience. It moved gently outward, becoming part of the background rather than the focus. At first, awareness might still have felt present and central. Over time, it stopped occupying the foreground. It did not disappear. It simply stepped back. This shift required no effort, with no tasks, no sounds, and no movement. Awareness had nothing to engage with. It drifted naturally to the edges. Breathing continued without being observed. Stillness remained without being noticed. Sensations existed without being examined. The mind did not try to hold awareness in place. It allowed it to settle where it naturally wanted to be. This reduced mental tension completely. Thoughts faded because they required attention to remain active. Without central awareness, they could not form clearly. This state felt calm and spacious. Awareness was present but distant, like a soft light no longer shining directly. As awareness settled into the background, the sense of self softened further. There was no central point of experience to maintain. Sleep arrived quietly from this diffusion. There was no transition to notice. Awareness had already stepped aside. By allowing awareness to settle into the background, medieval rest completed itself without effort. Nothing needed to be watched or guided. Awareness rested quietly out of the way, and sleep took its place naturally. Ritual 66. Letting the body feel quietly supported. People allowed the sense of support to exist without focus. As the night remained still and the body stayed at rest, medieval people did not actively think about what was holding them. The surface beneath the body did its work without being noticed. Support was present, but it did not demand attention. Early in rest, the body might still register contact, the firmness beneath the back, the steady pressure under the legs and shoulders. Over time, these sensations softened. They did not disappear, but they no longer stood out. The body did not test this support. It did not shift to confirm stability. Trust had already been established through repetition, night after night. The same support had been there. This quiet trust reduced effort completely. When support is unquestioned, muscles do not stay partially engaged. They release fully, allowing weight to settle naturally. Breathing continued slowly and evenly. The body did not brace itself. It allowed gravity to do what it always did. The mind followed this ease. It did not check whether the body was safe or stable. There was no reason to monitor. Familiarity had already answered those questions. Thoughts became sparse because nothing required response. There was no imbalance to correct, no sensation asking for change. As support remained quietly present, awareness softened further. The body felt held without being felt in detail. Sleep arrived gently from this trust. There was no sensation of letting go. The body had already done so. By letting the body feel quietly supported, medieval rest deepened without interruption. Nothing needed confirmation. The night held the body steadily, allowing sleep to arrive naturally and without effort. Ritual 67. Allowing the mind to rest without direction. People stopped guiding thought and allowed it to become still. As rest deepened, medieval people did not steer their thoughts. They did not choose what to think about or try to clear the mind. Thought was allowed to slow on its own. Early in the night, thoughts might still have wandered gently. Simple memories, ordinary impressions. Over time, even this wandering became less frequent. Without direction, thought lost momentum. The mind did not resist thinking, and it did not encourage it. It remained neutral. This neutrality allowed thoughts to fade naturally. Breathing stayed slow and even. The body remained still, without movement or stimulation. The mind had little to respond to. Thoughts that did appear felt incomplete. They did not form full narratives. They arose briefly and dissolved without attention. This lack of direction reduced effort. When the mind is not guiding itself, it does not work. It rests. The night provided a safe space for this. There was no need to plan or decide. Nothing depended on mental clarity. As thought became quieter, awareness softened further. The mind did not hold on to silence. It simply rested within it. Eventually, even the presence of thought became rare. The mind existed without content or direction. Sleep emerged quietly from this stillness. There was no final thought to release. The mind had already settled. By allowing the mind to rest without direction, medieval nights remained simple and unforced. Thought slowed, softened, and stepped aside, making space for sleep to arrive gently on its own. Ritual 68. Letting the night feel familiar again. People allow the night to feel known rather than observed. As rest continued and awareness remained soft, medieval people did not treat the night as something new or unusual. Darkness was not examined. Quiet was not questioned. The night felt familiar, like a well-known place that no longer required attention. Early in rest, the mind might still notice the darkness, the absence of activity, the sense of enclosure. Over time, these qualities stopped standing out. The night blended into memory and routine. This familiarity reduced alertness. When something is well known, it does not demand focus. The mind did not need to stay aware of where it was. It already understood. The body rested within this familiarity. Breathing stayed slow. muscles remained loose. There was no reason to remain partially awake. Sounds, if they occurred, fit into expectation. They did not signal change. They were part of the same night that had always been there. Thoughts slowed because there was nothing unfamiliar to process. The mind did not search for meaning or explanation. Everything felt already understood. This sense of familiarity was comforting but quiet. It did not create emotion or reaction. It simply removed uncertainty. As the night felt more familiar, awareness softened further. There was no reason to stay present. The mind did not hold onto the moment. Sleep arrived gently from this recognition. The night did not feel like something happening. It felt like something continuing. By letting the night feel familiar again, medieval rest remained steady and unforced. Nothing needed attention. The body and mind rested within what they already knew, and sleep followed naturally. Ritual 69. Allowing rest to complete itself. People did nothing to finish the process of falling asleep. As the final moments of awareness thinned, medieval people did not try to cross into sleep. They did not look for a final step. There was no action left to take. Rest had already unfolded on its own. The body was still. Breathing was slow. Thought had softened. Awareness was light and distant. At this point, doing anything would have reintroduced effort, so nothing was done. The mind did not attempt to relax further. The body did not adjust. This absence of action allowed rest to complete itself. Sleep did not need encouragement. It did not need permission. It arrived because nothing interfered. There was no anticipation, no waiting, no sense of nearing an end. The process was already complete before it was recognized. Awareness did not disappear suddenly. It faded gently, like a sound becoming quieter without stopping all at once. The night remained steady as this happened. Darkness did not change. Silence did not deepen dramatically. Everything stayed the same while awareness slipped away. Sleep arrived without being noticed. There was no final thought, no last sensation. The mind simply stopped participating. By allowing rest to complete itself, medieval nights ended without effort or intention. Nothing was achieved. Nothing was finished. The body and mind simply remained at rest until awareness was no longer present, and sleep took over quietly and completely.